In the shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient trees twisted like arthritic fingers clutching at the fog-shrouded sky, the swamp lay in eternal repose. Its waters, thick and unyielding, held secrets older than the hills themselves, secrets that whispered through the reeds in voices too faint for mortal ears. It was here, amid the ceaseless drone of insects and the fetid breath of decay, that Elias Thorne first glimpsed the child. The boy, or what appeared to be a boy, floated face up in a pool of stagnant mire, his skin pallid as moonlit marble, eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the void above. No bubbles rose from his lips, no breath stirred the oily surface, yet when Elias reached out with a gnarled branch to prod the form, it stirred with a slow, deliberate motion, as if awakening from some abyssal slumber. The air grew heavier as Elias dragged the child ashore, the mud sucking greedily at his boots, reluctant to release its prize. Up close, the boy's flesh bore no marks of drowning or exposure. Instead, a subtle rot clung to him, an aura of putrefaction that made the nearby water congeal into dark, crimson threads, like veins pulsing beneath translucent skin. Elias, a trapper hardened by years of isolation, felt an unfamiliar chill snake through his veins, a primal dread that urged him to thrust the child back into the depths and flee. But curiosity, that insidious tempter, held him fast. He carried the boy to his ramshackle cabin on the swamp's fringe, where the lantern light flickered uneasily, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. That night, as the moon hung low and bloated over the treetops, the child stirred again. His voice emerged not as a cry or whimper, but as a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the wooden walls, stirring dust from the rafters. Elias leaned closer, his ear attuned to the sound, and within it discerned fragments of a language forgotten by time, words that evoked visions of colossal forms stirring in lightless chasms, of blood that refused to flow, trapped in eternal stagnation. The swamp outside responded in kind, the waters, once merely sluggish, now thickened visibly, their surface mottled with clots of reddish scum that bubbled and popped with faint, grotesque sighs. By dawn, Elias noticed the first true omen: a deer, drawn inexplicably to the cabin's threshold, collapsed at the boy's feet. Its eyes glazed over as its body shuddered, flesh sloughing away in wet, ragged strips, blood pooling not in liquid rivulets but in viscous, unmoving puddles that mirrored the swamp's own corruption. The child watched impassively, his small hand extended as if conducting an unseen symphony of decay. Elias backed away, his mind reeling with the dawning horror that this was no ordinary foundling, but a harbinger, a vessel through which the ancient Malays of the land sought to reclaim what had long been buried. And as the sun struggled to pierce the perpetual mist, the swamp's stagnant blood began to stir, hungry for more. The swamp had always been a place where things went to die quietly. Cypress knees rose like grave markers from the black water, and the air hung so thick with moisture and rot that every breath felt borrowed from something long dead. Elias Thorne knew its moods better than most. He'd trapped beaver and muskrat along its edges for 3 decades, learning to read the subtle shifts in the wind, the way the fog pooled in certain hollows as if guarding secrets. But on that late autumn afternoon, when the light slanted low and copper through the Spanish moss, he found something the swamp had not yet claimed. He was poling his flat-bottomed skiff through a narrow channel he rarely traveled, one choked with duckweed and water hyacinth, when he saw the pale shape floating amid the debris. At first he took it for a drowned fawn, limbs splayed in that boneless way of the newly dead, but as he drew closer the illusion shattered. It was a child, a boy no older than 8 or 9, lying supine on the sluggish surface as though the water itself cradled him. His clothes were ragged homespun, dark with saturation yet oddly intact, the fabric neither torn by snags nor bleached by prolonged immersion. Most unnatural of all was the boy's face. Skin the color of tallow, eyes wide open and reflecting the bruised sky with perfect clarity, lips slightly parted but issuing no bubbles, no sign of breath. Elias killed the engine of his mind and simply stared. In 30 years he had pulled many things from these waters: rusted traps, skeletal remains of livestock, once the bloated body of a missing moonshiner, but never a child so eerily preserved. There were no livid marks of strangulation, no bloating of submersion, only that waxen pallor and an expression of mild curiosity, as if the boy had been placed there moments ago rather than lost for days or weeks. Yet the smell reached Elias even before he leaned over the gunwale, a sweet sick cloying stench of advanced decay, the kind that clings to carcasses left too long in humid shade. It rose from the child in waves, mingling with the swamp's usual miasma until the two became indistinguishable. When Elias extended his pushpole and gently nudged the small shoulder, the body rolled with deliberate slowness, not the limp flop of the truly dead but a controlled motion, like someone turning in sleep. The boy's eyes tracked the movement, fixing on Elias with a steadiness that sent ice through the trapper's veins. Around the small form, the water responded in kind, thickening, darkening, threads of crimson unfurling beneath the surface like ink dropped in milk. The stagnant pools that had always lain dull and olive now gleamed with a viscous sheen, as though the child's presence alone had awakened some older, deeper corruption. Elias felt the swamp watching, waiting, its ancient patience stirred by this unnatural offering that refused to sink, refused to rot in the usual way, but instead carried decay as a living aura, tainting everything it touched with the promise of endless, unrelenting putrefaction. Elias Thorne's cabin sat on a low rise of firmer ground, a weathered box of hand-hewn logs half swallowed by vines and overshadowed by a stand of water oaks whose roots drank greedily from the swamp's edge. It was the kind of place folks in the nearest holler called Thorne's Folly, for no sane man would choose to live so close to water that breathed miasma and swallowed light. Yet Elias had dwelt there alone since his wife took fever and the earth took her, finding a rough comfort in the isolation that kept prying eyes and questions at bay. When he carried the child across the threshold, the boy weighed almost nothing, as though the swamp had hollowed him out and filled the cavity with its own dense stillness. Elias laid him on the cot by the hearth, peeling away the sodden rags to reveal skin unmarked by bruise or blemish, yet cool and faintly slick, like river stone left too long in shade. He built up the fire, more out of habit than hope, and set a pot of chicory coffee to boil while he considered what to do with this impossible stray. Folks down in the valley might know of a missing child, though no one had come searching these back channels in years. The nearest family willing to take in strays was the Harlows' old Mara and her grown son Caleb, who kept to a clearing 2 miles along a raised footpath of cypress planks. By twilight Elias had wrapped the boy in a threadbare quilt and poled him across the shallows to the Harlow place. Mara met them on the porch, lantern raised, her face creased like old leather beneath a grey kerchief. She took one look at the child's unnaturally composed features and crossed herself twice, murmuring a half-remembered prayer from childhood. Caleb, broad and silent, lifted the boy without a word and carried him inside to a small room at the back where the air smelled of dried herbs and lye soap. That first night the Harlows kept vigil. Mara spooned warm milk sweetened with sorghum between the boy's lips, and though he did not swallow in the usual way, the liquid disappeared all the same. Caleb sat in the doorway with his rifle across his knees, watching the child's chest neither rise nor fall. Outside, the swamp answered their charity with subtle malice. The shallow bayou that bordered their garden, once clear enough to see tadpoles darting, grew opaque by morning, its surface filmed with a dark, oily sheen that caught the light like clotted blood. Reeds along the bank wilted as though scorched, their green bleeding away into sickly brown. A heron that landed to fish rose again with feathers matted and dripping scarlet, croaking once in distress before vanishing into the mist. Mara noticed it first while drawing water. She plunged the bucket and drew up a thick, viscous strand that clung to the rim like half-congealed sap, smelling of iron and deep rot. Caleb tested the nearest channel with a pole and found the water resistant, slow to part, as though it had begun to remember it was blood rather than mere liquid. By the second day the stagnation had crept closer to the house itself, pooling in hoofprints left by their mule, darkening the footing beneath the porch steps. The Harlows spoke little of it, but their eyes kept returning to the silent child lying motionless in the back room, his presence somehow anchoring the corruption, drawing the swamp's ancient lethargy inward until the very air around their home felt thick enough to chew. The first creature to come was a raccoon, fat from late-season persimmons, waddling bold as brass along the footpath that skirted the Harlows' porch. Caleb saw it from the doorway where he rocked in a cane-bottom chair, whittling a decoy he would never finish. The animal paid him no mind, nose twitching toward the open window of the back room where the child lay. It climbed the steps with unusual purpose, paws silent on the weathered boards, and slipped inside before Caleb could rise. Mara found it minutes later, crouched beside the cot like a supplicant. The raccoon's fur had already begun to loosen in wet clumps, revealing raw pink beneath that darkened even as she watched. Its eyes, bright with ordinary cunning moments before, filmed over with a milky sheen while blood oozed thick and slow from its nostrils, not dripping but pooling, refusing to spread across the pine floorboards. The creature shuddered once, a full-body convulsion, then collapsed. Where its blood touched the wood it soaked in greedily, leaving dark stains that looked less like spills and more like veins seeking root. By morning the yard teemed with death drawn in by the same invisible summons. A pair of grey squirrels lay twisted in the grass, their luxurious tails matted flat with congealing crimson that clung like tar. A red fox, sleek and wary by nature, had dragged itself beneath the porch steps only to expire with mouth agape, tongue swollen and black, blood crusted in the corners like old wax. Even the birds fell victim. Cedar waxwings that usually flitted high in the tupelo gums plummeted one by one, striking the tin roof with soft thuds before sliding into the mud, wings splayed, tiny chests heaving until the last breath carried away in a faint red mist. Mara tried to burn the carcasses, but the fire refused them. Flames licked at fur and feather only to retreat, leaving the bodies smoking yet intact, blood within them thickening to sludge that hissed but would not consume. Caleb dragged them instead to the edge of the bayou and heaved them into the water. They did not sink. Instead they floated low, half-submerged, rocking gently as the darkened surface closed around them like a mouth reluctant to swallow. Within hours the bayou itself mirrored their fate, broad patches of water turned viscous, threads of scarlet weaving through the black until entire channels gleamed like fresh wounds reluctant to clot. All the while the child remained motionless on his cot, eyes half-lidded, watching the parade of dying things with the mild interest of a dreamer observing clouds. Whenever another creature crossed the threshold, drawn by hunger, curiosity, or some deeper compulsion, its decay accelerated the moment it came within arm's reach of him. Flesh sloughed, blood stagnated mid-flow, and the swamp beyond the window answered with a low, wet gurgle, as though savoring each new offering added to its slow, patient feast. The Harlows barred the door eventually, but the animals came anyway, scratching feebly at the walls, pressing against the shutters until their small bodies gave out and added their weight to the growing ring of corruption encircling the house. The child had not spoken in the week since his arrival, not in any tongue the Harlows recognized. He lay on the cot with the patience of stone, eyes half open, reflecting the lamplight like still water. Mara had begun to think of him as a doll someone had forgotten to wind, beautiful and terrible in its stillness. Then, on the seventh night, when the moon was a thin scar behind racing clouds and the swamp outside groaned with its own weight, the boy turned his head toward her as she mended by the fire. His lips parted, but no breath came. Instead a sound rose from deep within him, low and resonant, like wind moving through a cavern no living soul had ever mapped. It was not a cry, not a word at first, only a vibration that made the tin cups on their hooks tremble and the flames in the hearth flatten as though pressed by an invisible hand. Mara dropped her needle. Caleb, dozing in the corner with the rifle across his lap, jerked awake, hand tightening on the stock. The hum shaped itself slowly, gathering syllables older than the mountains, older than the Cherokee footpaths that once crossed these ridges. The words tasted of earth and iron, of things buried too long beneath peat and bone. Mara felt them settle behind her eyes like sediment stirred from a pond bottom. Images came unbidden, vast shapes coiled in darkness far below the swamp's false floor, forms that had no edges, only slow pulsations of intent, rivers of blood that had ceased to flow before the first tree took root, trapped in perpetual thickness by a will too ancient to name. The child's voice grew clearer, though his mouth barely moved. He spoke of guardians forgotten when the glacier retreated, of a compact broken when iron blades first bit into these hills. Each phrase carried the weight of centuries, spoken not to the Harlows but through them, as if they were merely the nearest hollow reeds for an older music. Caleb tried to stand, to cross the room and silence whatever this was, but his legs would not answer. The air had grown dense, pressing him back into the chair like wet wool. Outside, the stagnant pools answered. The darkened water bulged in slow domes, as though something immense tested the surface from beneath. Reeds bent without wind. The crimson threads that veined the bayou brightened, glowing faintly with their own sour light. Mara saw, in the flickering visions the child poured into her mind, faces half-formed in the muck human once, perhaps, their mouths open in silent warning or supplication. The boy's gaze never left hers. In it she read neither malice nor plea, only recognition, as if he had waited countless turns of the seasons for someone to hear the fragments he carried. The ancient entities stirred in their sleep, dreaming through him, and the swamp's corruption was merely their slow exhalation after eons of holding breath. Word of the strange child and the dying animals spread slowly at first, carried along the ridge roads by trappers and herb gatherers who had seen the Harlow place from a distance and turned back without knocking. By the time the tales reached the scattered hamlets nestled in the folds of the mountains, they had thickened like the bayou itself, each retelling adding new layers of dread. Folks began to shun the footpaths near the swamp, claiming that after dusk the mist rising from the water took on shapes, tall, elongated figures with arms too long and faces blurred as if seen through rippled glass. Old Widow Klein, who lived closest to the Harlow clearing, was the first to speak of true visions. She woke one midnight to find her hound whining at the door, hackles raised toward the darkness beyond the porch. When she cracked the shutters, she saw them, pale forms standing knee-deep in the stagnant pools, their outlines flickering like candle flames in wind. They mirrored the child's posture exactly, heads tilted in mild curiosity, arms hanging loose at their sides, eyes reflecting whatever feeble light the stars offered. As she watched, frozen, one of the figures lifted a hand in slow greeting, and she felt the gesture meant for her alone, recognition from something that had worn other faces long ago. Within days others reported the same. A moonshiner making his way home along a deer trail swore he passed a dozen such apparitions lined along the water's edge, motionless as herons until he drew near, then turning in perfect unison to track him with gazes that burned cold. Children in the valley schoolhouse began drawing the same picture during lessons, stick figures with oversized eyes standing in red water, though none had ever laid eyes on the boy himself. Even Preacher Rawls, who dismissed most talk as heathen fancy, admitted after evening service that he had glimpsed movement in the swamp while riding past, translucent shapes that seemed to mouth silent words, their lips moving in time with a rhythm he could almost hear beneath the croaking of frogs. The spectral figures never crossed onto solid ground. They remained bound to the corrupted water, rising only as far as their waists, as though tethered by invisible weights. Yet their presence seeped into dreams and waking hours alike. Those who saw them clearest, Mara Harlow most of all, noticed how the apparition's eyes held the exact unblinking steadiness of the child's, a shared stillness that suggested they were not separate entities but reflections, echoes cast across time by whatever dwelt within the boy. Each night the stagnant blood in the bayou glowed faintly, outlining the ghostly assembly in dull crimson, and those who dared look too long carried away the sensation of being watched in return, of ancient attention finally roused and fixed upon the living world once more. Mara Harlow had always clung to the old ways, the ones her grandmother carried over the ridge from Scots-Irish stock, simple rites of salt and scripture, water blessed under a full moon. When the animals kept coming and the bayou turned the color of old slaughter, she decided the child needed cleansing, the kind only holiness could provide. She sent Caleb to fetch Preacher Rawls, but the man refused to cross the footbridge, claiming a sudden ague. So Mara took matters into her own hands, drawing water from the rain barrel that still held some purity, murmuring the Lord's Prayer over it until the surface shivered with her breath. She carried the bowl into the back room at dawn, when the light through the chink windows was thin and grey. The boy lay as always, eyes half-lidded, watching her approach with that mild, depthless curiosity. Mara dipped her fingers and flicked droplets across his forehead in the sign of the cross. Where the water touched his skin it beaded at first, clear and trembling, then darkened swiftly, turning the hue of bruised wine. The beads did not roll away, instead they thickened, clinging like leeches before soaking in with a faint hiss. The boy's lips curved, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement, and the blessed water left faint rust-colored streaks across his brow, as though iron filings had risen from within. Undeterred, Mara fetched the family Bible, its pages soft as cloth from generations of hands, and read aloud from the Gospel of John, voice steady even as her heart hammered. She poured the remaining water over the child's chest in a thin stream. The liquid struck the quilt and spread, but not as water should. It congealed mid-flow, strands stretching like melted taffy before breaking into viscous clots that steamed gently in the cool air. The smell that rose was sharp and metallic, the reek of an abattoir left too long in summer heat. Within moments the quilt darkened, fibers drinking the corruption until the fabric looked saturated with old gore. Caleb burst in at the sound of her choked cry. He saw the bowl now cradling a semi-solid mass the color of liver, its surface filmed and pulsing faintly as though alive. Where drops had spattered the floorboards, the pine had blackened, veins of rot spreading outward in branching patterns that mimicked roots seeking nourishment. Beyond the window, the swamp answered with a low, wet surge. The nearest pools bubbled and thickened further, crimson scum rising to coat the cypress knees like fresh scabs. That evening the corruption reached the garden. Rows of collards and turnips that had withstood early frost wilted in hours, leaves curling black at the edges, stalks oozing a dark sap that refused to drip. The well water, drawn fresh that morning, turned brackish by dusk, thick enough that the bucket came up trailing red threads. Mara tried once more, late into the night, sprinkling salt across the threshold and reciting psalms until her throat rasped. But the salt dissolved into ruddy sludge, and the words seemed to sink into the heavy air rather than rise, swallowed by the same ancient patience that watched through the child's unblinking eyes. The house itself began to breathe the rot walls, sweating a faint moisture that carried the tang of blood long shed, floorboards softening underfoot as though the very timbers had begun to decay from within. Caleb Harlow had always been the one to mend what broke: fences, tools, the occasional rift with neighbors who strayed too close to their still. When the garden failed and the well turned foul, he took to prowling the swamp's edge with a spade, searching for some natural explanation, a dead hog upstream, perhaps, or a seep of mineral poison. On the third such morning, with fog clinging low and the air thick enough to taste, his blade struck something buried just beneath the peat along an old beaver run. It was a journal, small and bound in cracked oilskin, the kind a surveyor or preacher might carry. The pages inside had warped with damp but held their ink, spidery script in faded brown that might once have been black. Caleb carried it back to the porch, wiping mud from the cover, and sat with it through the afternoon while Mara kept watch over the child. The first entries were mundane dates from the 1840s, notes on water levels, sketches of cypress stands, but deeper in, the tone shifted. The writer, a man named Obadiah Wren, recorded the birth of a son who came forth pale and quiet, taking no milk yet thriving all the same. Page after page detailed the same pattern repeating across generations, a child born every few decades to different families scattered along the swamp's fringe, always unmarked by the usual cries or coloring of newborns, always drawing sickness to livestock and blight to crops. Wren wrote of his own boy, lost to the water at 7 years, only to be seen years later by travelers standing waist-deep in the bayou, unchanged, eyes reflecting starlight like polished glass. He claimed to have traced the line back through church records and whispered kintales to a time before the settlements, when the natives avoided certain pools entirely, calling them places where the blood of the earth had soured and would not flow. The later entries grew frantic. Wren described attempts to break the cycle, drownings that failed, burials in consecrated ground where the soil rejected the small bodies, pushing them back to the surface within days. He wrote of dreams shared by every bearer, vast coiled things beneath the bog feeding on stagnation, using the children as eyes and mouths, waiting for the land to forget vigilance so they could rise. The final pages were smeared, as though written in haste during rain, a warning that each vessel grew stronger than the last, gathering the corruption dropped by its predecessors, until one would remain long enough to wake the sleepers fully. Caleb read until the light failed, the journal heavy in his lap. Outside, the stagnant channels gleamed darker, reflecting nothing now, and from the back room came the faint, familiar hum that had become the household's new heartbeat. The diary's oilskin cover bore faint indentations on the inside, tiny handprints, pressed deep as though a child had gripped it from within while it lay buried, waiting for someone to unearth the record of its endless, rotting lineage. The change came gradually, then all at once. On the 9th night the child rose from the cot without sound or effort, bare feet touching the floorboards as though the softened wood welcomed him. Mara, dozing in her rocker, woke to find him standing at the window, small palms pressed to the glass. Moonlight filtered through the mist outside, silvering his pale skin, but the glow that answered was not from the sky. The bayou beyond the porch had begun to move, slow, deliberate undulations that parted the crimson scum and revealed deeper currents of thickened blood pulsing beneath. He lifted one hand, fingers splaying, and the stagnant pools obeyed. From the nearest channel rose a shape, a column of viscous red that coiled upward like smoke given weight, twisting into the crude outline of a human torso, headless at first, then sprouting crude features that shifted and reformed, eyes forming as dark clots, mouth a ragged slit oozing slower drops. It hovered just above the water, swaying in time with the boy's faint gestures. Other forms followed, smaller, some no larger than rabbits, others tall as the cypress knees they mimicked. They arranged themselves in a silent semicircle facing the house, dripping yet never diminishing, their surfaces rippling with whispered syllables too low for human ears. Inside, Caleb clutched the diary, pages trembling in his grip as he read by lamplight how earlier vessels had managed faint tricks, making water ripple or fog thicken, but never this deliberate shaping. The child turned then, eyes catching the lantern's flame without reflection, and the grotesque figures outside mirrored the motion, heads swiveling in unison. When he tilted his wrist, one of the larger forms extended an arm of congealed blood, fingers elongating into thin tendrils that tapped gently against the windowpane directly in front of his own hand. The glass fogged with a breath that was not breath, leaving smears that spelled fragments of the ancient tongue he had hummed nights before. Mara tried to speak, to command him back to the cot, but her voice emerged as a rasp, stolen by the heaviness settling over the room. The shapes began to whisper through the cracks around the door, secrets of buried massacres, of treaties broken when the first iron plows scarred the earth, of promises made to things that had no need of words. Each revelation carried the flavor of rust and grave soil, burrowing into the mind like hooks. Caleb felt his grip loosen on the rifle, visions flickered at the edges of sight, his own ancestors wading into the swamp centuries ago, offering blood to still older hungers. The child lowered his arms, and the figures subsided, melting back into the bayou with wet, reluctant sounds. Yet the water retained their memory, surface now etched with faint ridges that reformed whenever the boy shifted, ready to rise again at his slightest whim, patient puppets of rotting blood awaiting fuller animation. Rumors of the Harlow place had finally outgrown the ridges, carried down switchback roads to the county seat where men in tweed coats read newspapers and believed in progress. One such man was Dr. Elias Whitcomb, a folklorist from the State University who collected mountain tales the way others collected stamps. He arrived in a dusty Ford sedan on a morning when the fog refused to lift, armed with a notebook, a Kodak camera, and the conviction that superstition could be explained by mold spores or mass hysteria. Caleb met him at the footbridge, shotgun cradled loose in his arms, and warned him plain, "Turn back, the child was no concern of outsiders." Whitcomb smiled the thin, patient smile of academia and stepped past, boots squelching in the softening planks. Mara watched from the porch, face drawn tight, but did not speak. The air around the house had grown so dense that sound traveled slowly, as though passing through deep water. Whitcomb entered the back room with the brisk confidence of a man entering a lecture hall. The child lay on the cot, eyes tracking him with the same mild interest shown to every living thing that crossed the threshold. The doctor knelt, opened his satchel, and began a careful examination, pulse that was not a pulse, skin cool yet pliant, pupils that neither contracted nor dilated under the beam of his flashlight. He muttered notes under his breath, words like catatonia and hypothermia and possible fungal infection, as though naming could tame. That night he stayed, insisting on observation. He set up a cot in the main room, lantern low, notebook open on his chest. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams that began as ordinary recollections, his childhood home in Knoxville, his mother's garden, then shifted. The soil in the garden turned dark and wet, roots pulsing like veins. Figures rose from the turned earth, his grandparents, his long-dead sister, even himself as a boy, all pale and silent, mouths crusted with dried blood. They reached for him with hands that dripped thick crimson, pulling him down into the loam where something vast waited below, patient and hungry. He woke gasping, lantern gutted out, the room colder than mountain stone. In the dark he felt presences, ancestors he had never met, their faces half remembered from faded tintypes, standing in a silent ring around his cot. Their eyes gleamed with the child's reflected steadiness. When he stumbled outside to clear his head, the bayou had crept closer, lapping at the porch steps with slow, deliberate tongues of congealed red. Shapes moved beneath the surface, elongated arms reaching upward as though to guide him in. By dawn Whitcomb's notebook lay abandoned, pages filled with frantic sketches of coiled forms and staring faces. He sat on the edge of the porch, staring into the thickened water, whispering names of the dead as though greeting old friends. Caleb found him there hours later, rocking gently, hands trailing in the viscous scum, murmuring about roots that needed feeding and blood that had waited long enough. The doctor's eyes, once sharp with scholarly detachment, now carried the same unblinking depth as the child's, fixed on depths no living man was meant to see. The nights grew shorter, yet the darkness lingered longer, as though the sun itself hesitated to cross the ridges. On the 11th day the child no longer lay on the cot but stood at the center of the room, small feet planted wide, arms hanging loose at his sides. His eyes, once merely depthless, now glowed with a dull crimson light that pulsed in slow rhythm with the bayou outside. Mara and Caleb watched from the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. The air within had thickened to the consistency of cold syrup, pressing against their chests with deliberate weight. The swamp answered his awakening with a sound never heard before, a deep, resonant throb that rose from the deepest channels and rolled across the water like distant thunder trapped underground. The stagnant blood began to heave in vast, deliberate waves, cresting over cypress knees and lapping higher against the porch pilings. From every pool and runnel rose columns of congealed red, thicker now, shot through with darker strands that twisted like veins seeking union. They merged as they ascended, forming towering shapes that dwarfed the cabin, limbs branching into impossible joints, torsos swelling with the accumulated rot of centuries, faces coalescing only long enough to fix the Harlows with ancient, unblinking recognition. The child raised his arms, palms upward, and the entire swamp responded as one organism. The thickened surface bulged and split, revealing glimpses of something far larger stirring beneath, coils vast enough to span the horizon, surfaces slick and mottled with the same crimson sheen, moving with the patient certainty of glacier. Each motion sent ripples of viscous blood surging outward, inundating the raised footpaths, swallowing the lower gardens of distant farms, carrying with it the faint, wet sounds of exhalation after eons of silence. Dr. Whitcomb, still seated on the porch edge, slid silently into the rising tide without resistance, his body buoyed for a moment before the red closed over him. Shapes formed around his descending form, ancestral faces pressing close, mouths working in silent welcome. Farther out, the spectral figures that had haunted the mist now stood fully revealed, no longer translucent but solidifying from the blood itself, ranks upon ranks stretching back into the fog, eyes glowing in perfect synchrony with the child's. The cabin groaned as the water reached the floorboards, seeping through cracks with deliberate hunger. Mara clutched Caleb's arm, feeling the pulse in his wrist slow to match the swamp's new heartbeat. Beyond the windows the pulsating sea spread in all directions, climbing the slopes in slow, inexorable sheets that carried fragments of older worlds, bone, rusted iron, petrified wood toward the higher ground. The child turned at last to face them, expression unchanged, and in that mild gaze they understood the awakening was complete. The entity no longer dreamed through a vessel but stirred in its own immensity, ready to reclaim the mountains one stagnant heartbeat at a time.